Hello everyone. This video is going to cover primarily chapter 14 of the textbook, and that is focusing on the remaining steps of the health communication program implementation process. So we're focusing on implementation, evaluation, and maintenance of health behaviors as we go forward here. Let's get into it and see what we got. So here is again the key steps according to Dupre in our textbook. We have these 7 steps. We've already talked about the first 4. That would be defining the situation, the potential benefits, analyze and segment the audience, establish campaign goals and objectives, and select communication channels. Our first proposal and analysis papers should have covered all of those steps. We should feel really confident now that we understand the problem and we have a good sense as to how to solve it and how to get people involved with that solution in their own lives. Now, the remaining steps are specifically designing the campaign message. And so we'll spend a lot of time talking about that here in this video. And then next, we want to pilot it and implement it. And then the follow-up of the project of evaluation and maintaining. Now, I also have this diagram up here. Again, this is not from our textbook. This is from a different health communication textbook that's a little bit more focused on public health and advocacy. But you can see at least, I like the reminder of this, thinking of this as kind of a cycle. Because when we get to the point where we're talking about evaluating and maintaining and implementation and piloting, all that stuff, it is really important that we remember that these projects don't ever really end. Some people will do the same kind of research for their entire career, and that means that once one project is over, they're already thinking about applying those lessons to the next project. That's how it works in the grant writing world. And while that's one specific aspect of health communication, when we're talking about these kind of health communication programs, that's kind of the best example we have of these interventions. As they call them in epidemiology, they call them a non-pharmaceutical intervention, and that's exactly what we're doing. And so it's helpful to remember that this goes in kind of a cycle, right? We are doing research, we're gathering information, and that's part of the project as well when we get to that point of the program and the evaluation and maintenance. But let's get into these in a little bit greater detail. So it's time that we apply some theory to getting our campaign started. Now, we've talked about a lot of theories, obviously, lots of social influence theories and things like that, but we're not always thinking about them in terms of behavior change, which is usually the goal of a health campaign. So we want to look at that, and we'll consider a couple specific theories this time around to meet that goal, all right? Specifically, we're going to need to consider some theories of behavior change. And of course, the last 3 steps of our program cycle. That is the goal of this video. Designing campaign messages, the theories specifically. Here's a couple that we're just some representative theories here, right? So when we're designing campaign messages, we are usually relying on lessons from both marketing and like social norms and social behavior, social cognition type theories. And so these are our kind of 2 examples. Social norms is a specific theory. We're going to mention a couple other ones here. But essentially, these all kind of fall under this umbrella of recognizing that we like to behave in ways that are perceived as consistent with our peers. So often people are making decisions not based on the most rational, logical, credible information, but based on their social group. And as always, it's important. I mean, we can always use COVID-19 as an example. I know I've belabored that point a lot, but it is the most prescient and relevant example still. Despite all the uncertainty around it, people don't make decisions based on the best information. They make the decisions based on their social group. What is your social group doing? Are they protesting mandates of any kind, or are they promoting that everyone, even down to 5-month-old babies who have almost no risk of COVID, get vaccinated with these new vaccines, right? Those kinds of decisions. Well, neither one is inherently logical on its own. There's a lot of context that we have to consider, but people don't do that. That requires nuance. And so that's one of the major challenges of health campaigns, is fighting against kind of the impulse to be intellectually lazy, because when there's high uncertainty, we don't really like taking responsibility for those kinds of decisions. But social norms theory is one of those theories that explains some of these behaviors a little bit. And now we also want to think about the relationship with marketing here. For example, in social marketing, there are the 4 Ps, and we can draw comparisons between these and what we do as health communicators. So there's price, product, promotion, and place. So price, well, there is a price to all the behaviors we're asking someone to enact or whatever it is. It may be a cognitive price. It may be a financial burden. It may just be challenging their values or their identity, but there's always a price to pay, right? And one of our major goals is making sure that people don't see those barriers as too big to warrant taking action, to warrant avoiding taking action, right? We want to overcome those barriers and convince them that they're not as bad as either the consequences of not taking action, or they're not as not so detrimental that it's not worth pursuing good results. Product. What is the product? Well, that's what the behavior we're trying to get someone to enact, perhaps. Or it could literally be a product, right? Promotion. We have to have these messages that are promoting our health behaviors, because if we decide that we need to have some sort of intervention, then we are already acknowledging that something is not happening yet, and we have to get that message to people. And then place. We have to consider channels. We have to consider where the action can occur, not just, where we go buy whatever cleaning spray or food product, but where can we get people engaged with this message and change their behavior. Now, but at the end of the day, this is not marketing, right? We're not doing just marketing, and here are some reasons why it's different from marketing if you've taken a marketing class. One, health behaviors aren't totally analogous to products, as you can imagine. Marketing is going to focus a lot more on the seller's needs rather than the buyer's needs. And in this case, the seller would be us, selling the message or the behavior, and the buyer would be the target audience and who people are trying to get. And now in marketing, you're really maximizing your profits. You're focused on, and obviously, I think most people are good intentioned and they want to help people, but the goal of marketing is to increase sales specifically, right? That is the precise goal, and everything else is kind of secondary to that. Now, marketing is also a little bit more focused in that way on one-time or limited interactions. So there's not going to be as much effort to build relationships, at least not at the level that we're talking about with establishing groups, stakeholders and relationships, and building that kind of infrastructure. Really, it's about that exchange. And I think if someone's doing marketing well, they are going to be trying to establish a feeling of a relationship with their audience. However, the goal is to do that when it comes to the health kind of marketing behaviors, right? So health campaigns are longer term and they're iterative, like we mentioned before. It's a health communication cycle, right? And so that requires building trust with your key audience. A lot of the work that I have been involved with the Great Lakes Anishinaabe, that's only possible if you have relationships with the people and with the people that you're working with. And that is, I am not the person in charge of those things. The people in charge of those projects are tribal members, partners at the medical college, people like that. And so in order to have successful interventions and good research and all that, you've got to have those relationships. If it were just me, I would not be able to do that. Health campaigns are emphasizing that. So they rely on that relationship building. That is a critical part. That is half the goal, right? One part of the project is usually to change or intervene on some sort of health issue. However, the other half of that is building that infrastructure, is building those relationships so that you can have more partnerships going forward. And sometimes we're not targeting the buyer as the primary audience. The buyer, in this case, if that's the people trying to adapt the health behavior, a health campaign may not be targeting them directly. Maybe we're targeting, a senator. Maybe we're targeting legislation. Maybe we're targeting government organizations. There could be a lot of different people that the message is aimed at that are not specifically the end user of the health behavior or whatever it may be. Let's move on from that to consider some of the theories of health comm that we can apply now. So we can recognize that it's a little bit more complicated than marketing in some ways. I don't mean that to sound dismissive of how complicated marketing can be, because I'm not a marketing guy, really. But it's different at the very least, what we're trying to accomplish. There's overlap and there's similarities, but it is ultimately different. So let's look at some theories of health communication that we can apply here. First, I want to recognize how to use theories. There is an ongoing challenge in connecting social behavior and cognition to concrete health outcomes. I think we've mentioned that before, and if we haven't, you've seen it throughout the semester based on the content that we're talking about. This isn't always, well, a health intervention is going to be based on good, solid scientific data, right? There's going to be all sorts of laboratory information showing, okay, mercury in the environment, methylmercury is dangerous. How do we know that? Well, we've seen Minamata disease specifically in populations where methylmercury has been released in the environment and gets into the food supply. But we can also test that in vitro, in the laboratory. We can go in, we can have one dish with little baby zebrafish eggs and another dish, and only one of them gets dosed with methylmercury. And well, those fish, they get the methylmercury, they don't do so good. That's how hard science and biology works, right? There's a control and a treatment, and we measure the difference, and we say there's a causal relationship. However, when it comes to the behavioral aspects, if we're trying to, say, measure the relationship between our health intervention and people's actual health outcomes, that's much harder because, I mean, not just for the obvious reasons of like you can't dose people with methylmercury, that would be incredibly unethical and dangerous, but also because it's not always as simple as that, right? That wouldn't be what we're measuring. What we're trying to measure is, hey, here's our message that we give to people. Methylmercury occurs in the environment in these ways, and you should watch out for X, right? And then we want to measure whether or not people are actually watching out for X, and whether or not that affects their health outcomes down the line. And that's a little bit trickier to do because we're dealing with people. We often have to deal with self-reporting, etc. So there are ongoing challenges in connecting social behavior and cognition to concrete health outcomes. And we want to start with that assumption and keep that in mind. And everything that we do should be based on that kind of justification when it comes to these kind of health interventions. Now, theories can help us know how to develop our campaign. And there's a lot of social theories in health communication. This is why my field exists, so that we can apply those kinds of theories in meaningful ways and know what better to expect. So we don't have to exactly measure one-to-one every single time these causal relationships if we can predict what to look for and then look for that thing, right? Now, using theories in health communication campaigns, theories should be part of a toolkit. Right, you should be familiar with a lot of different theories and select one as a framework based on the situation on a case-by-case basis. Depending on what you're dealing with, some theories might be better suited to explaining those factors and the relationships between them. Our theories and our theoretical framework should also respond to the audience's needs. It doesn't really help them if we're just pursuing what is interesting to us. That's part of it, but we need to make sure that our intervention is focused on what they want and what they need. It should also address the specific contextual and influential factors, which you have considered through your analysis and through your proposal. You should have a pretty good sense of those contextual factors, and that will help you determine whether or not a theory is appropriate for that context. And it should be used to inform and guide message development and communication channels. It should be revisited depending on emerging factors and needs as you discover them in this, of course, iterative process. And you should revisit that. But you should probably maintain the same theory for most of the cycle. You shouldn't just switch it willy-nilly as you go along. We want to try and maintain the same assumptions as we go through and measure things against that theory, using that theory as kind of a solid ground to stand on and look around from. That's our perspective. We're picking that little hill. That theory is our little hill that we're standing on and surveying the surrounding landscape of this health communication context, right? So sometimes it's beneficial to change positions, but we can't just like move all over the place. So here's some theories that the textbook mentions. We have the health behavior model, which we've mentioned in the past. We'll go into that again a little bit here. This is a risk learning model, and it demonstrates the complexity of the health decision environment. We've kind of talked about that before. Social cognitive theory is another one that is comparing the role of the environment to those internal factors in terms of observation and learning. And it gives you some key steps in terms of what people need to go through in order to adopt a behavior. That would be getting their attention, reproducing the message in their heads and then in their lives, feeling motivated to perform that behavior, performance of the behavior, but then there's also that self-efficacy component of it. It's like, all right, I've tried that behavior. Now, how do I feel about it? Am I going to bring it into my life and carry it forward? And so there's a reason why we use this old theory, because it reminds us that there are different stages of adaptation of a behavior and application of it in our day-to-day life. Theory of reason to action. That one is another classic one, which is talking about how our attitudes plus our subjective norms or our social norms, right? That leads to our motivation to action. And this is useful for audience analysis in terms of figuring out what are the norms of that group. Speaking of norms, we also have social norms, which we mentioned above. It's been talked about by a lot of different scholars, these kinds of ideas. But essentially what we care about there is that decisions are sometimes made without even thinking about it, right? They're made without deliberation as a result of understanding of social expectations or moral norms. They're an unconditional emotional response. And so that raises the question for, at least for the purpose of health campaigns, like who are the key influential groups? Remember what I said when we mentioned that before, just a few slides ago, that, I mean, again, you can think of how this works in our day-to-day life right now. After the first couple months when people started we learned more in that first month about COVID-19 than we had learned, but we didn't have a whole lot of certainty. But people were a lot more certain, weren't they? Right? They were making decisions based on their social groups because that was enough time to see how their groups were taking a position on it, whether it was on the right or left. People took positions on policies, on interventions, on masking, on whatever, social distancing, lockdowns. People made those decisions based on their social groups, not based on rational understanding on both sides, right? So let's not kid ourselves and pretend. I'm not taking a dig at one side or the other here, right? I don't want you to be like, yeah, those stupid people on the left, or yeah, those stupid people on the right, for making those decisions. Everyone did that, okay? And it's really hard to get people to fight that thing. And that's one of the lessons that we take away from something like social norms, is that we're constantly struggling to adjust our behaviors in relation to our social groups and what they think. Peer pressure, right? Classic. And then we also have the stages of behavior change, also known as the trans-theoretical model. And that is outlining a lot of those steps, much like social cognitive theory. It's outlining a lot of those steps that a person has to go through before they will adapt or adopt a behavior into their life. And so we're going to look at a couple of these in greater detail. Well, here's the health belief model. We've been talking about it off and on this semester. It's probably one of the most formative and important models in health communication. This was developed by the Public Health Service back in the 60s or 50s. I can't even remember. But at any rate, we've talked about this before. Maybe it's now time to go into a little bit more detail. The textbook is finally mentioning it here in chapter 14. But essentially, in its simplest form, the health belief model is arguing that motivation is related to a couple different things, 5 things specifically. One is perceived risk or susceptibility. That means we believe we are vulnerable to the thing, right? We will suffer adverse effects if we don't change our behavior. Perceived severity, the effects of that health issue will be a problem, right? It won't be a minor inconvenience. We have to believe that it's actually going to be a problem to change our behavior about it. Perceived benefits, changing our behavior will in fact help that problem. Perceived barriers, we have to believe that that effort of changing our behavior is in fact worthwhile. And cues to action, something must get a hold of our attention and serve as kind of a referent in our mind for that behavior or change. Now, these things may seem a little redundant, and maybe they are, but they have been demonstrated to be fairly consistent, independent things, right? Perceived benefits versus perceived barriers, they are distinct things in our minds, right? What is it going to cost us, and is it going to be worthwhile, right? We do distinguish between these things in our mind. Now, this may also sound really obvious to you, but I believe pretty much anytime I mention the health belief model, I also mention that this was fairly innovative, which is kind of embarrassing, isn't it, as a society, that it took us up until like the 50s or 60s to start recognizing that, well, it's not as simple as just giving people the label on the medicine and that here's the information. You're a rational human being, make your decisions accordingly. Well, in the latter half of the 20th century, we really started recognizing that that's not how people work. Really following World War II, when we started questioning how, in the wake of the Holocaust, for instance, I think that was probably that was a major collective wake-up call for all of human society, where we're like, well, how could people do such terrible things? on such a scale? How could so many people agree to do such terrible things? And we start recognizing that, well, it's not always, we're not totally rational, right? We are subject to our social norms and social groups, and that's where a lot of this stuff is emerging out of. That's a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's always worth remembering that health belief model, the reason we talk about it all the time is because it was like one of the first models where we considered all these things. Here's what it looks like when it's all put together. You've seen this diagram before because I've shown it to you before. But this helps us understand, again, how these things relate to each other. It may sound to you like we're stating the obvious, but again, this is kind of the first situation where we recognize that, all right, well, perceived threat is shaped by both susceptibility and seriousness. And perceived threat is important for understanding whether or not we're going to pursue a specific outcome. But, up until that point, people were really just looking, all right, well, hey, look, it's a bad thing and you should do a thing. Well, that's not good enough, right? We need cues to action to get people's attention. We have to do a little bit of calculus over here, recognizing that the perceived benefits of action should probably be better than the perceived barriers to action. If that is a positive relationship, then we're more likely to pursue the recommended preventive health behavior. And then also in recent years, we have much more research supporting these different guys over here. That's that kind of sociocultural perspective the book is talking about, is recognizing these different variables and that they can influence this whole process. They can influence the whole perceived benefits of action minus the perceived barriers to action. And incidentally, as we get on to the other social comparison, social cognition, social norms theories, I want to draw your attention to this arrow right here, this relationship. That's probably what we're talking about when we're talking about leveraging those theories to modify perceived benefits of action. Those demographics, the socio-psychological factors, the structural variables, those things are going to shape perceived benefits of action and perceived barriers of action. Well, as you can see, there's arrows going everywhere, right? That influences all this stuff. And so again, that's a useful reminder to us that this is not a totally rational exchange. Everything from perceived susceptibility to the likelihood of pursuing the recommended preventive health behavior, everything is influenced by our social groups and our situation and our context. Now, of these different factors in the health belief model, you may be wondering which ones are most important for us to address in, say, a health communication campaign. Well, research suggests that barriers might be the most important thing to address, and I think there's a particular reason for this. I think it has to do with being risk averse. Now, that can be a little bit confusing because you're like, well, okay, well, if we're risk averse, then shouldn't we want to take action to avoid the risk of this health issue? Well, it's not that simple. When it comes to risk aversion, people tend to prioritize what's going to happen to them first, what's most likely to happen to them. The risk of the threat may be a little bit distant, amorphous. They may not have that in mind. And so the challenge then becomes addressing the barriers, right? The barriers first, and convincing them specifically that the risk of the threat is greater than the cost of enacting the health behavior, because we don't like change. When we hear about changing behavior, our first reaction is, what's it going to cost me to change this behavior? And that is the first risk or consequence that we will encounter, right? Not necessarily the health issue. So it was a primacy thing in our mind. What do we think of as the most important? What's it going to cost us, and what's it going to cost us first, right? So there's a little bit of a calculus here. We might need to convince them that the barriers to acting, the cost of acting, is going to be smaller than the perceived threat. So that's where some of this logical appeal is going to come in. We have to convince them that the perceived threat is greater than the perceived barriers. Then we're going to more likely maximize a behavior change. So now that's in general, right? That's a general consideration, but there are different considerations for different audiences. The exception to this would be, for instance, adolescents. And there's a reason why we worry about adolescents being so impressionable. They haven't lived long enough to really understand the relationship between cause and effect, to really empathize with their peers. There's a couple reasons for that. One is just lived experience. Another is the actual physiology of the brain. It doesn't start getting completely developed until like 25. I think like something like your neurons don't have enough, myelination to really have solid connections between consequence and action. I'm not a neuroscientist. Don't hold me accountable for that one. But what we're dealing with here is often the personal fable. You remember that? We've mentioned that in the past. What is the personal fable? That is this belief in one's own uniqueness, right? And we are all unique, right? But it's unique in a particular way. It means that you believe you are the exception to the rule. You are the hero of your story. And we all do this to a certain extent, but it's very pronounced in adolescence. The personal fable is looking at the Titanic crashing into the iceberg and all those people dying and saying, what a bunch of idiots for getting on the Titanic. They shouldn't have done that. Right. But that's an attribution error, right? They had no way of knowing they were going to die just because they're on the Titanic. But perhaps you get what I'm getting at here. An adolescent will look at that and be like, well, that wouldn't happen to me. I wouldn't get on the Titanic. So, oh, you wouldn't, would you? Please tell us how you would know not to get on the, you get the idea here. That's how the personal fable works. It is this belief that you are the exception to the rule, not the rule itself. We could even talk to adolescents about the personal fable, and they would be like, wow, people are so stupid for believing the personal fable. Good thing I'm not stupid people like that. Right. And again, we can recognize this tendency in ourselves and others, but as with many things, it was probably worse when we were younger for a variety of reasons. So again, when we take that and apply it to this kind of setting of health belief and health communication, if your target audience is adolescents, you may have to work harder to convince them that they are at risk of a thing. They can hear about cancer and think how terrible it is and empathize with those people in that situation. Well, maybe they're sympathizing rather than empathizing. They can do all that without ever believing that they will ever be at risk of developing cancer. So when it comes to communicating with young people, rather than minimizing the perception of the cost, the barriers, young people have lots of energy. They're ready to change behaviors. They don't have all these built-in habits. So that's not so hard for them. But believing that they are at risk, that is harder. But either way, we still have to maintain that relationship. We have to make sure that the perceived threat is greater than the perceived cost of action. Here's comparing a couple of these different theories. These two theories with black headings, the social cognitive theory and the trans-theoretical model or stages of behavior change, those are two that the book is talking about. The other two are not mentioned in our textbook, but I put them up here for a specific reason. I would like you to be able to compare them. This is a chart I made earlier in the semester to compare some different social influence theories, because when you read a textbook, you just don't really understand. Like, it's just, they all sound the same, don't they? They're, oh, well, this one's saying that there's 5 steps and this one's saying there's 6 steps. But the point of all these theories is to recognize the role of environment and context and observation and learning, and recognizing that the adaptation of a new behavior is a process. So what these all have in common is that they lay out these different steps in that process of hearing a message. That would be kind of this pinkish salmony color up here. That's what all these theories are talking about. All right, well, we hear the message and then we move on to think about the message. And then we try out the behavior it's requiring. Maybe we perform it more than once. Maybe the trial or implementation stage is just kind of thinking about it, extending it. And then there's also this additional step down here of adopting that behavior, the final step of adopting or maintaining that behavior in our day-to-day life. So does it matter really which theory you use? Well, I don't know. If you like having a template, you might like communication for persuasion, because it's got all these specific steps that you can follow in terms of, all right, I need to go through each one of these steps to get my audience to adopt this behavior, and I'm going to make sure that they get through everyone. That's fine. But what I want you to recognize is there are these different steps. It's not as simple as like, here's a message, here's a new behavior, and then someone enacting it. But how do you make this useful to you in your projects? Well, I think the trans-theoretical model adds this interesting element of even the additional consideration are they even exposed to the message yet? Before that you even get their attention on the message, you want to think about, are they in a state of pre-contemplation even? Like, are they even aware of this issue? Well, that might shape how you begin. But other than that, I mostly just want you to recognize that there are these steps to adopting a behavior. It's not not a simple exchange, and so we have to bear that in mind. Now, that's a good segue into designing campaign messages. I want to talk a little bit about things like framing and logic and emotional appeals, but beyond that, it's going to kind of, I mean, it's all contextual, right? It's always contextual. It depends on the context. But let's look at some general rules or tips that we can apply. How can we apply these theories? If all of this is intimidating for you, and by this, what I mean here is if you don't feel confident in your ability to interpret and apply these theories, that's okay. The easiest way and the best way to ensure success and the way to work around being that kind of expert is to involve the stakeholders. And that's why these books have an emphasis on participatory research. It's a little bit more foolproof. Is it more complicated and convoluted and a pain in the butt? Yes, yes it is. It absolutely is. Involving more people in the project complicates the project. If you've experienced working on a group project, you have, you know this, right? More people in the project complicates things. You have to deal with people's schedules. You have to deal with freeloaders. You have to deal with all this stuff. And the same thing applies in health campaigns. When you pull in community members and you do the participatory research approach, it's a pain. It's really inefficient. However, that's how we get the most diverse perspectives. It's a way of pre-testing our materials. It's a way of ensuring that we're on the right track, and it generates more creativity, but you got to do it right. And again, another one of these benefits here is that you don't have to worry, so you don't have to overanalyze everything so much from a theoretical perspective. If you have the community members and you can directly ask them, hey, what do you think of this message? Right? That makes it a little bit easier on you in that way. So we may not have that going for us right now. For our projects and for the sake of completing your project and applying these theories, here are some tips that can help us on that approach. You can have the participatory approach, and that can make things a lot easier in designing your message with pre-testing. But here are some tips that we can deal with right now. So one, be clear about what you're trying to change and affect, and that will help you determine who your audience is. Determining your audience helps you determine your voice. We've already done our audience analysis, so hopefully we should have a good sense as to what kind of personality our message should take. This could be a literal voice in terms of your spokesperson, a celebrity, speaker, or whatever it is, the person narrating the video. Or it could just be the tone of the messages. But in particular, we want to consider a couple things. What is the personality or mood of the campaign? What should it be? We'll get to that in a second when we talk about emotional appeals. We also want to think about, should this come from more an authoritative perspective or a peer kind of perspective? Is this, do we want this to be leveraging more credibility and authority, or do we want it to leverage more social norms and peer pressure? One consideration when it comes to something like authority is that if you use too much of a fear appeal from the perspective of a position of authority, you know, the lab coat plus fear appeal can have the opposite of the desired effect. It can scare people into helplessness and inaction. They'll freeze up, right? Oh, this is too scary. So too much threat can be a problem as well. And so we want to be aware of that. Again, we'll address that a bit more as we get into the emotional side of things here. We want to ask, though, first, should we be using more emotion, or should we be using more logic, or both? I think the spoiler here is usually both, but you're going to have to still think about it and be calculated. Leveraging both would be doing what we refer to as parallel processing when we consider social influence in like ELM and the elaboration likelihood model. Remember, there's a central root of persuasion, the peripheral root of persuasion, and maybe it's best to leverage both, right? Heuristic cues. Do they look like they know what they're talking about? Are they wearing a lab coat? That would be a heuristic cue. Are they charismatic? Do they have a good engaging manner? That would be more of an emotional heuristic peripheral appeal. But then we still want to have good, compelling information, good credibility, and sound reasoning. That would be a logical appeal. If you're leveraging both, you're leveraging parallel processing, and that's desirable. Now, ultimately, when it comes to voice, ask yourself, is the audience likely to respond to this person? You have the benefit of knowing what it's like to be in the audience because you've picked communities that you're part of, theoretically, right? The college community or something. So are you likely to respond to that kind of person? Or would you find them kind of patronizing and tone deaf, like when you see like the cartoon engine block selling premium gas, like it's an energy drink for your car, dude. Don't you see? I understand you so much, dude. Yeah, that's a little patronizing, right? So ask yourself realistically, is the audience likely to respond to this person? And that'll get you pretty far. Another consideration is homophily, right? So people tend to like people or trust people that look like they're part of their in-group. So do we look like a college student? Are we acting like a college student? Do we believe that that person is part of our in-group? That can help as well. Now, when it comes to actually designing the message, framing matters. You're going to have to decide how much yourself, but it does matter. We have the gain frame and we have the loss frame. In health communication perspectives, we talk about this in terms of promotive versus preventive framing. Now, keep in mind that with these frames, the message can be the exact same message, but different language, right? The message may be, all right, we need to be healthier and improve our diet, eat less processed foods kind of thing. But eating less processed foods, so how do we frame that? Do we frame it as promotive, like, hey, eat healthier foods? Don't eat these foods, eat vegetables and meats and animal fats, and that's going to be better for you. And you're going to be strong, you're going to be healthy. Well, that's more of a promotive thing, right? Promoting a good diet as opposed to preventing a bad diet and saying, you better not eat all these vegetable oils or you might get cancer. Ooh, and you want to avoid that. So that's a framing thing. And there is a cultural difference. Sometimes people from different cultures have different preferences, but I think for your sake right now, in terms of the framing, let's consider this as another kind of emotional appeal and decide that way. Do we need the tone of our message to be more positive or more negative? We can say the same message in different ways. So again, people tend to be risk averse, and so they're going to focus on negativity a lot more than positivity. So if you want a hopeful message, you're going to really have to lean into the positive over the negative. Maybe Monroe's motivated sequence could be useful for that. We talked about that a little bit. That's a persuasive appeal in public speaking. But at any rate, measure against this are lessons from the health belief model. Not only should the perceived threat seem larger than the perceived barriers to action, but you can also, if you want to be more positive, we also want to emphasize that the perceived benefit is greater than the perceived barriers. It's going to cost you a little bit, but man, the returns are totally worth it, right? That's another calculus here. So both of those exist at the same time. The gain frame would be talking about the perceived benefit being greater than the perceived barriers to action. The loss frame would be the perceived threat is greater than the perceived barriers to action. It's up to you how you frame those, and you're going to need to decide how. Now, logical appeals, we'll keep this one short. Hopefully by now I've convinced you that people are not totally rational, but we do need to count that as a factor. One of the lessons from elaboration likelihood model, which is kind of true sometimes depending on the context, but one of the assumptions of that model is that people need to elaborate on the message, think about the message in their head in order to adopt that behavior or be persuaded in the long run. That is a rational thing, a rational assumption, but people are spurred to action by heuristic cues all the time. So remember, logical appeals they're kind of necessary, but we can't rely on them entirely. We have to get people the information that they need. It has to be good information, and that can help us build credibility. And we got to do it. But if we rely on that, we may not have the desired outcome. Emotional appeals may detract or distract from the hard facts, and so we need to plan accordingly. Right? Remember that they may fixate on the emotional appeals and ignore the hard facts or miss them entirely. So we have to be strategic about this as well. Now, finally, talking about emotional appeals here, I think as a general recommendation, don't fight fire with fire. The textbook has pages and pages of different situations, like here's an emotional appeal that worked in this way, and here's another one that, well, what's a generalizable trend we can take out of it? I think this is the simplest way to think of it. Are they already scared? If so, you probably don't need to convince them more about the threat, right? You may need to convince them more of the benefits to acting now. So if they're scared, you may just leverage the fact that they're probably already motivated to find a way out of that fear. Are they aware of the issue at all? If they aren't scared, well, then maybe you need some negative framing to help them recognize how big the threat is. If they don't see it as a threat, you need to convince them of a threat. If they see it as a threat already, then you need to convince them of the action. So you'll need to judge this, match the emotion to the goal. But I think that this is a good general strategy. Don't fight fire with fire. Now in the remaining part of this video, we're going to briefly talk about steps 6 and 7 of the process here. That's the piloting, implementation, and evaluation. These are important for your project in that you need to consider how you would measure success. That's what I care about right now. And that's the whole point of the justification for your final project. You're going to talk about it in that way. You have that accompanying document. I mean, your intervention could be a meme for all I care, but it should be polished, it should be well reasoned, and you should have a good reason for picking that, right? That's where the justification comes in. Now, these last two steps are reflecting how this process works out in the real world. So if you're going to do a health intervention, you're a health communicator like me, you're applying for grants and stuff, NIH, the National Institutes of Health, are not going to fund a grant that does not have a piloting plan, that does not have an implementation plan, that does not have an evaluation plan. If you do not have measures of success built into that grant proposal, they will not fund it. They simply won't. And they shouldn't, because you have no way of knowing if you're going to be successful. So these things are kind of going in that direction. The piloting and implementation, we'll start with that. That's more a comment on evaluation, but let's start with piloting and implementation. There's not a whole lot to say about this because this is doing the whole thing. This is doing the project that you've been doing. You should have done this already, right, throughout the whole process. Now, piloting is the exception to that, of course. Piloting means like pre-testing your message. Getting early feedback from representative members of the target audience. I would compare this to, if you've got a speech for your public speaking class, you should probably give it to your roommate or someone else before you give it to your class to test it out. Same idea with this kind of message. So you get a focus group or something together and you give them the message and say, hey, what do you think about that? This is very, very important in the real world. It's another thing that people view as kind of expensive, time consuming, and tedious, but it's going to ensure greater success. We should test our message. Here's some good questions. And as an aside, when possible, you should be aiming for more information beyond yes or no. And if you probably know what I'm talking about if you've ever taken a survey and it asks you a question and like it limits your answers and you're like, well, yeah, but, or no, but, like there's always context. And so when possible, we still want to elicit more information beyond yes or no question. These are phrased as yes or no questions, but you want to be able to answer these questions for yourself, right? So whatever pre-testing method you use or survey, what you want to get out of it is an answer to these kinds of questions. Are the messages easy to understand? That's important. If they don't understand the message, they can't do anything with it. Do the messages seem relevant and important to the audience? Again, we're not going to act on something unless it seems relevant and important to us. Is the message appealing, right? Is it appealing to them aesthetically? Is it appealing to them intuitively, morally, whatever it may be? How do they feel about that spokesperson? Who is the spokesperson? Who's doing the talking here? And are they appropriate, or does the audience interpret that person as a tone-deaf weirdo who is totally disconnected from who they are and their actual concerns and needs? And does the message seem controversial? Controversial messages can be useful for getting attention. However, controversial messages are polarizing because people tend to already have opinions about controversial subjects. If I say something like gun control, abortion, some controversial subject, you have an emotional response to even those very words, probably because you already have an opinion about them. If you don't have an opinion about them yet, it's just going to make you uncomfortable. So we can use controversial messages to get people's attention, but we have to be careful what we do with that information or what we do with that attention. We would want to have a follow-up and give them, again, same with fear appeals. You can scare them, but give them a way to navigate out of that fear. Now, it's time to implement the plan. That's part of step 6. Once we have a good idea of our message and its effect, then we should go ahead and distribute that message through the relevant gatekeepers, channels, etc. Here's an image just showing kind of a standard modern digital and mixed media, proportion of how ads go out. Now, you're probably not going to be going on all these different things. This is from marketing, but I thought it was relevant. Your message may only be going through 1 or 2 channels. That's fine. You will know which channels to use based on all that research on the front end. This kind of marketing approach, that's helping people, just cover all their bases and proportionally doing so. You should be a little bit more strategic and targeted in your approach because you've done all that research. However, it's still probably best not to keep all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. You should have a couple of routes of persuasion. Maybe we have it going on TV, and maybe we have it going on Facebook and TikTok or whatever. But if you're trying to change people's behavior on TikTok, well, then you should probably send it through that channel. You get the idea. Your research will tell you what to do this. This should all extend from your audience and situation analysis. There's not a whole lot else to say about implementation other than execute the plan that you've worked really hard on up to this point. But now finally, you also need to monitor that plan. You have to evaluate and you have to maintain the behaviors. The evaluation side of things, this is simply asking that you have a measure for success. We want to remember that health behaviors typically don't change immediately, speaking to kind of the maintenance side of things. But evaluation is about measuring success and how you're going to do that. So health behaviors are not going to change in such a way that that's so easy to detect, not unless we're really lucky. It's going to be hard to measure all this. So now evaluation can be as simple as asking questions after treatment, right? So if you've got, say, your piloting group and you ask them some questions like, what are your attitudes about X health behavior now, before you're exposed to the message? Okay, we survey them, we measure that, then we expose them to the message, and then we come back later and we say, all right, what are your attitudes about the message, about the health issue now? Well, that's an example of an efficacy study in terms of using kind of this small group of people, hopefully a representative sample. That's a lot easier than measuring what we call effectiveness, and there's a couple reasons for that. An efficacy study allows you to ensure that they are exposed to the message before they respond to certain questions. You can limit external influences. You can expose them to multiple messages and measure the difference, right? Again, here's the first message, here's a different message. What's the difference between the two? So this is as close as we can get to an experiment, a social experiment, but an experiment nonetheless. We're trying to control for a lot of these external factors. It's harder to measure the actual effect on people's lives, and that would be an effectiveness study. Think about how polls never seem to be very accurate, right? Political polls. Why is that? Well, the only people that are answering those surveys are like old people with landlines, right? If they call me, I'm going to hang up on them. I don't want to talk to people like that. And I'm a survey guy. That's embarrassing. I should probably be a little more accommodating to people who call me, cold call me with surveys. But you can think of some other challenges to this as well. But what I really want you to do is think of a way to try and measure success. You're going to need to describe something in your project. Maintenance is about incentivizing behaviors over time. And that has to do with, all right, we do want to make a health behavior change. If we want to ensure that we want to keep building those relationships, the infrastructure, that's all critical here, right? Are we having periodic encouragement? Are we refreshing the message for the audience at time to time? Are we enabling skills training? Well, I'm not as worried about this right now for you, for your project, so much as you need to be aware that this is a critical part of these kinds of projects as well. They're never a one and done thing. It is now because the semester's over. That's fine. But out in the real world, this is an ongoing process. Now, finally, if nothing else, when it comes to evaluation, have a plan to measure success. Try to measure the reach, that is the number of people exposed to the message, and specificity. Have a way of knowing if you got to the right people. But for your projects, just keep it simple, but keep it specific, right? So if you want to change curricula, sex education curricula, what do you want to change, right? How will you know if you've succeeded? Will it be if, okay, by 2023, they will adopt this new topic, and we will be able to see that in curriculum? That kind of stuff. You want to be specific. So go back to that whole objectives thing, and for your justification, make sure you write in there, all right, We will measure success in this way. We will see this happen at this time by these people. So who's going to do what by when? That's what we want to see in here in terms of evaluation, and you should have a plan to measure that. Be as specific as you can. If you're struggling with that, let me know. I'm happy to help. All right, this video has gotten plenty long already. I know we covered a lot of stuff there, but I hope that you found it useful. In fact, I hope you found the whole class useful, because this is the end of the course and the lecture material. I hope that I've managed to get this material situated for you and useful, and I wish you all the best of luck in the future. No one's going to become a public health person overnight, but this course has given you a background of how health communication is applied, not just in public health, but in our day-to-day lives and patient-provider communication and beyond. And so I hope you can take some of these lessons and apply it in your own life, even if you don't go on to do a bunch of public health campaigns like we're talking about here. All right, onward and upward. Thanks for your time, and take care.